Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be talking about the 2026 Nebraska Senate race. This race is going to shape out to be a really interesting race in my opinion. The two candidates likely as the two frontrunners are Pete Ricketts and Dan Osborn. Pete Ricketts, the incumbent Republican senator, and Dan Osborn, an independent candidate who is running this race to replace Pete Ricketts. Now, this race is really going to shape out to be a really interesting one in the sense that Dan Osborn is not a typical Democratic candidate. In fact, Democrats have chose to not run a candidate when Dan Osborn is on the ballot. Why, you may ask? Because Democrats believe they have a much better shot at electing someone like Dan Osborn who could cross over and receive Republican votes versus a regular, normal Democrat. And this has played out before. This race actually took place before in 2024 for a special election type term, where Pete Ricketts was running to serve the remainder of the term. His term's technically up in 2027, so this race in 2026 is to serve a full 6-year term. Pete Ricketts was appointed to this seat after serving as governor when Ben Sasse resigned to go serve as a president of a university in Florida. So Pete Ricketts is up for a full 6-year term in 2026. Now, in 2024, Dan Osborn ran in a Senate race then as well. That race was not against Pete Ricketts, though. That race instead was against Deb Fischer, who, when he ran against her, he made the race quite competitive, actually. Many people thought that the race actually had a shot of flipping. So we're going to look at some of the details out in the race, of course, today, but I wanted to start by pointing out a Osborn internal. I should note that from the very beginning. So this is obviously going to, could sway one way, of course, has this race with Pete Ricketts having a 1-point advantage. This was between 600 likely voters and was conducted at the beginning of February. So, with this said, let's go ahead and take a look at the 2024 United States Senate races in Nebraska. So if we start by looking at Pete Ricketts' race, he won this seat by 25.2%. And if I go over, he faced Preston Love Jr., who ran as a Democrat, and he won by a very solid margin. So you might be asking yourself, well, can't he do that again? Can he win by a large margin again? And to that I would say absolutely. He has a shot of winning this race. In fact, he's probably the favorite to win. But it's important to note that when this race was between Deb Fischer and Dan Osborn, that they had a much closer race. In fact, polling towards the end of this race was quite close. Some, of course, had the race similar to what it ended up being, with about a 7-point margin. Same thing with this one as well, 7 points from YouGov. So, of course, it depended on the poll that you looked at, but overall, this race was much closer than the race between Ricketts and Love. So, with Dan Osborn running in this Senate race in 2026, the question is, can he make it competitive again like he did in 2024? Now, he ultimately ended up losing this race to Deb Fischer, but I would say in large part the reason for that is because of how well Donald Trump did. I think Dan Osborn absolutely has a shot, especially in a year that's not going to be quite as favorable to Republicans. Now, Deb Fischer won this race. She won it by a solid margin, but substantially much closer than that of Pete Ricketts when he ran here in 2024 as well. He won by 25 points. The Nebraska Senate race between Fischer and Osborn was only a 6.7% margin in favor of Fischer. Now I'll make note too, Deb Fischer is not necessarily the most popular senator, so she ultimately had an uphill battle, I guess you could say, if you will. She had a much more difficult shot at winning compared to my opinion of Pete Ricketts, who has a slightly better chance between the two. But it's important to note. So Pete Ricketts won this race by 25.2%. If we go look at the overall average from 2024 presidential race, Nebraska's counting all the votes in Nebraska, Trump won it by 20.5%. So Dan Osborn actually outperformed Donald Trump when he ran 2 years ago. So the question again is, can Pete Ricketts do this when it's not a Democrat on the ballot, when it's an independent instead? Because it's also important to note, from what I can find, Dan Osborn has committed to not caucusing with either party. So hypothetically speaking, if the Republicans end up losing this race and they lost Ohio, they lost Maine, they lost, let's say, North Carolina. I should move over to the Senate map. I don't think I have it on here though, or I would. But let's just play this out. North Carolina, Maine, and Ohio, hypothetically speaking. Say they all flip. That leaves Republicans with 50 seats. But if they lose that race and Dan Osborn wins, even though he's not caucusing with Democrats, still gives Democrats the upper edge, because at that point, Republicans only have 49 seats. So hypothetically speaking, at that point, it would give Democrats with their independent 50 seats to 49, and then one independent who wouldn't caucus with either party. So of course, this is just hypothetical, and the race will really see how it starts to shape out in the months ahead. But it's important to note, this race is going to be substantially interesting. If we look back at some of the early polling between Ricketts and Osborn, it's showing that Osborn's likely going to make this race competitive again. Now, I want to point out, all of the polling that has been conducted thus far, on here at least, I showed you the internal poll earlier. That's not on this, of course. But all the polling that has been conducted has been with a Democratic lean to it. But every single poll has had this within a very close margin. Pete Ricketts leading by 1 point, Osborn leading by 1 point, Ricketts by 1 point. And these were all conducted, March 28th to April 1st, 2025, July 2025, and then December of 2025. So the internal poll that I showed you at the beginning of the video is the most recent poll that we have out of this race. And it just goes to show that this race is still looking to be competitive. So with that said, I think Pete Ricketts ultimately has the upper hand in this seat. I think that he's more likely to win. If you watch my Senate prediction map for the month of February, you'll see that I still have this in the likely Republican column. I don't expect that to necessarily change at this point. But we'll see. Polling is suggesting that this is going to be a much closer race than I believe it will be. And let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think that this race has a chance of flipping? Do you think Dan Osborn, I guess you could say flipping, do you think Dan Osborn has a shot of winning this race, or do you think Pete Ricketts holds on to it? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys again so much for watching. I appreciate you so much. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video. And of course, as always, I will see you guys in the next video.